The Enigma of Oaks Ames, Oaks Ames Symposium, Stonehill College, September 21st. First lecture by Edmund Hans, The Enigma of Oaks Ames, the Early Years, 1804 to 1852.
Okay, good morning. Thank you for coming. My name is Frederick Ames, and welcome to Stonehill Library and the John W. Martin Jr. Institute for Law and Society. We are grateful to Stonehill College and to the college archives for hosting us today. I want to add a special note of gratitude to Director of Archives and Historical Collections, Nicole Casper. Nicole has been the linchpin of organizing this event, and simply put, without her, this symposium would not have happened. Thank you. And Maury Klein. If Nicole Casper is the producer of this event, then Maury Klein is its director. He suggested the title for the symposium, and he shaped the content. His imprimatur added the academic gravitas that was responsible for attracting our Pulitzer Prize-winning speaker and Murray's friend, T.J. Stiles. In 1973, after the shovel buildings in Easton were sold, large collections of shovels and extensive Ames Company records going back to the first days of the company from the 1770s and up until the 1950s were found and donated to Stonehill College. From 1973 to 83, the catalog and care of the collection was the responsible of Professor of History Judy Sergi, who worked with students until 1983, when Louise Keneally became the college's first full-time archivist, overseeing not only the shovels, but the college archives and the Novak papers as well. In 1998, Greg Gaylor, who was using the collection as part of his research for his doctoral dissertation, was hired as the collection's first-time full-time curator. From 1973 to 2001, the collection was stored at Stonehill in the basement of Donahue Hall, which was formerly known as Stonehouse Hill House, built in 1905 for Frederick Lothrop Ames. The estate was sold to the Congregation of Holy Cross in 1935, and Stonehill College opened in 1948. In 1988, when the college built a new library, it closed the Cushing-Martin Library. The building was renovated and reopened in 2001 as an academic building, Cushing-Martin Hall. As part of that reservation, Greg Gaylor worked with college officials to create a more appropriate home for the shovel collection. During Greg's tenure at Stonehill, additional collections, including ones relating to the Ames family and the Ames Shovel Company, were also acquired. And I'm glad to see that Greg is here today. And there is Greg sitting right over there next to the lady in the orange sweater. So, most recently, the Ames family have donated the papers of David Ames Sr. Last year, over 300 people visited Stonehill to see the college's famous collection of 783 shovels, and there will be a tour at lunchtime, and the collection is just a short distance away. And there are 783 different types of shovels. The shovels were part of the 1973 donation as well. 20 to 30 people came to use the collection to do primary resource, and thanks to the continued generosity of the David Ames family, the archives will soon embark on several digitation projects and begin to make parts of the collection available electronically. Our sponsor today is the Northeastern Savings Bank, whose generous donation is in keeping with their tradition of supporting local events and organizations in Easton. My personal thanks to Vice President Courtney Palm for her help in securing the donation. Also, thanks to Carolyn Cole and Paula Peterson of the Oaks Ames Memorial Hall Association for their help with promoting the symposium and organizing the speaker's reception at the hall. The symposium is being video recorded by Easton Community Access TV. This is our schedule. We'll start this morning with two speakers, Edmund Hans, who will talk on Oakes's varied interest and his early life in Easton, and Jay Wickersham will talk on Oakes's involvement in the Shovel Company from the 1840s up until his election to Congress in 1863. There will be a 10-minute break between speakers for you to stretch your legs and get some coffee. Each speaker will talk for 45 minutes, and there will be a 15-minute time allowed for questions. After lunch, Maury Klein will speak on Oaks, the Union Pacific, and the Credit Mobilier scandal. Our fourth and final speaker will be T.J. Stiles, The Last Days of Oaks Ames, the First Days of a New Era. We are scheduled to end at 3:30. Following the symposium from 4:30 to 6:30, there is a speaker's reception at the Oaks Ames Memorial Hall. We want to give special thanks to the generosity of Condra Goldrup of Farmer's Daughter Restaurant for providing the food. We're almost there. Okay, the reception is no charge to attendees. All four speakers will be at the reception, and you will have the opportunity to chat with them. Complimentary wine will be served. Now, the purpose of the symposium. I don't have everything written out word for word here. This is a quote, "The road must be built, and you are the man to do it. Take hold of it yourself. By building the Union Pacific, you will be the remembered man of your generation." And most of us in this room recognize that as the quote, Abraham Lincoln talking to Oaks in 1865 to get him to sign on to this project. Now, 154 years later, when people hear the name Oaks Ames, they usually say, "Oh yes, Oaks Ames, the Credit Mobilier scandal." They say it with a knowing look, and they don't. And that is why we're here today, to give Oaks a long overdue examination of his life, of his times, and the man himself. Oaks was given a short shrift by history. I'm hoping this will be an inflection point for history to move back to the reality of Oaks Ames. Thank you. Our first speaker, Edmund Hans, is a retired history teacher and a longtime resident of South Easton. Few residents of Easton have given as much of their time and talent as he has to this town. For many years, he has served on the board of directors of the Easton Historical Society. In 1993, he published Easton's Neighborhoods, the first comprehensive history of the community since 1886. He has written numerous articles focusing on Easton in the 18th and 19th century and on the work of other well-known architects in Easton besides H.H. Richardson. A natural speaker, you're going to get a natural speaker for a change. He is considered Easton's most entertaining tour guide. As an active genealogist, as well as an historian, he has researched several hundred Easton houses for inclusion in the Massachusetts Historical Commission's MACRIS database, which is a tremendous amount of work. His current research interest is the Civil War generation in Easton. And before Ed comes up, I would just like to call attention to a special Oaks Ames descendant who is here. Has traveled a great distance, and that's Lee Froelich. Now, Lee should be greatly appreciated by us because almost single-handedly, she turned the Ames Monument out in Wyoming into a National Historic Park, a landmark park, excuse me. Yeah, she's known for correcting. And it was a heroic effort. I mean, really Herculean. And we owe a tremendous amount of her as a loyal descendant of Oaks. And we had a great time out there in Laramie. She's also a great hostess. So again, I would like us to give a round of applause to acknowledge Lee and all she has done. Thank you. And it is now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Edmund Hans.
Yeah, excellent. Welcome. I always believe when you introduce somebody, you sort of downplay accomplishments, especially that great speaker stuff. But we'll work on that. I do want to announce that my friend here in the front will be leaving for a funeral. That's not a sign for a general exodus. So please hang with me. I'd also like to say thanks to a number of people who essentially are sitting right over there. This presentation would not be possible without the extensive research of two people, and that's Greg Gaylor, whose thesis is the basis for our modern understanding of the founding of the shovel company and Oakes's early involvement there. And then the second person is Sarah Ames, Mrs. John Ames III, whose absolutely fantastic editing of the diary of Oakes's wife, Evelina, has appeared online, and she is also the source of almost all the family photographs that you'll be seeing today. Without those two, we would not have my presentation, which may prove to be good or bad. We'll see. So, enigmas. What do enigmas mean? Well, I am dealing with the era from 1804 to 1852, and when we blessedly get to the last slide, that's the first time I'll mention a railroad. Because for me, there are plenty of other enigmas to deal with Oakes. The first one happened 171 years ago today, September 21st, when a tall, non-bearded man from Illinois was giving a speech in Taunton. That's Abraham Lincoln. And the big question for historical researchers in Easton for many, many years is, were there Ameses present? And after spending a summer trying to figure that out, I'm no closer to an answer than anybody else has been. The evidence is good that they were there, but we'll never be able to prove it unless a diary or something like that comes up. Another enigma, another very simple enigma, is this picture right up here. It says Oakes Ames, and it has a wonderful provenience. It says National Archives. They should know what they're talking about. And it comes from the Brady collection. But this is the only picture I have ever seen of Oakes Ames without a beard, okay? And looking at how the beard ages, longer, shorter, lighter, darker, the date here of 1862 is probably wrong. My guess is, after doing some photo analysis, that it is Oakes Ames, but from the 1850s. So it's probably the earliest picture you're ever going to be seeing of Oakes. The family in the first two generations didn't really jump to get their picture taken very often. So with that, let's get started. So in order to understand Oakes Ames and his character, which is essentially what I'm going to be looking at, you need to understand his father, Oliver Ames, and his mother. Unfortunately, for the pages of history, women at the beginning of the 19th century didn't leave much of a trace. This is a picture of Susanna Anger, but that's about all I'm going to be saying about her, other than the fact she died in 1847. Oliver Ames was the dominant figure in Oakes's life, and he was born in West Bridgewater. And there is a park over there that has some of the remains of his operation, of his father's operation. Captain John Ames was Oakes's grandfather, and Oliver was one of his younger sons. Now, we were talking last night about how did Oliver get interested in shovels. John made shovels and gun locks and just about everything that a blacksmith makes. But one of the older sons, David Ames, actually was the director for a relatively short time of the Springfield Armory, which was sort of, as Fred said last night, the Silicon Valley of early 19th century America. So Oliver apprenticed with him for several years, and then came back with the idea of not being just a blacksmith, but being someone who uses more modern techniques to produce a large number of one item, and the item he chose were shovels. For the next decade, that pursuit was very, very single-minded. Now, one of the things that we're going to be talking about here goes back to discussions when Greg was actually working on his thesis. His research shows that Oakes was a really tough businessman, to the point where he was able to manipulate the bankruptcy of his brother's business to his own advantage. And the operation or the interaction between the Ames boys did seem to be a little tough. So Greg had this picture of a rough, tough businessman, and yet when you look at the personal remembrances of people who were alive at the time of Oakes, the thing that they speak about is his works of charity, his tenderheartedness, and I suppose it's easy to say that about the biggest employer in town, but those seem to be corroborated. So what I see, trying to reconcile these two, is a person that had sort of a tough outer shell, his business side, and then personal side was much different. We're going to be explaining that. All right, so in 1803, Oliver Ames fended his way through the wilderness and ended up parked in front of where our town library is today on a plank bridge surrounded by trees. He told the family later on that when he pulled his chaise up, the tree branches were so close they brushed up against the side of his wagon. He was here because Eliphalet Leonard III had a nail factory and had gone bankrupt. The Leonards and the Ameses were both early families in the iron business here in Massachusetts, long pedigrees going back to the 17th century. But Leonard had gone broke for a variety of reasons. The business climate for nail making was not that strong in the early 19th century due to foreign competition. So young Oliver, who had just been married a few months before, came over here, looked over the situation, and discovered that there was a house, a dam, and a small nail factory. And at that time, the small pond that was behind the dam was called the Trout Hole. And that's today what we call Shovel Shop Pond. The space between the Trout Hole and the other large pond that you see here is known to Easterners as the island. It's more islandly than you might imagine because Queeset Brook runs down one side of it, and on the other side is the flume for the shovel company. So the island was where the nail factory was located, and you have a picture here of the house. The center portion of the house was what was there in 1803. It was probably a full cape, and then Oliver, as he was modifying the factory for shovel production, also added an addition to the house, expecting a large family. And that was a pretty good expectation because the second child in the family was born the following year. Now, let's take a look at that family. And again, you notice the dearth of there's no baby pictures, folks. Primarily because photography really hadn't been invented by the time these guys were babies. But you see the classic picture of the three oldest brothers, Oakes, Oliver, and Horatio. If you look at the picture of Horatio, it looks like he has white knee socks on, but it's a trick of perspective. That's actually the wall in back of him. He's dressed as normally as the others. You also notice that Oliver Jr. Has that really stylish hat and a really stylish sack coat on, whereas Oakes kind of looks a little rumpled, and that's the look. His wife spent innumerable hours patching and cleaning his clothes because he was very careless with his attire. So Oakes came along, was born in Easton in 1804. Horatio followed the next year. Horatio was larger and stronger than his older brother almost immediately, and that's, I think, an important part of the story. Oliver came along a little bit later, and we'll talk about that in a moment. William was born here in Easton was born in Plymouth in 1812, and then the two girls were born here in 1814 and 1817. Every single man involved in this, including the husbands of the two daughters, were involved in making the shovel company work, either close by as Oakes and Oliver, or far away manning stores or getting orders. So in the early 19th century, business was very much a family affair. So for those of you who aren't from Easton, Easton has a lot of neighborhoods, and Oliver came to North Easton. When he came to the town, there were about 170 houses and 1,500 people in town. There were almost as many barns as there were houses. North Easton was pretty sparsely settled. When Oliver stopped on that plank bridge, he said, I could see one farmhouse in that area. There was a fair number of houses out on the Bay Road, which connected Boston to Taunton and New Bedford. And when he took his shovels to work, to Boston to sell, he would take them up the Bay Road. Starting an industrial enterprise, which he had in mind of being very, very large, put him at a distance from his neighbors, and it would be several generations before the farmers of Easton really got comfortable with the fact of they had a giant shovel company in North Easton. And that's a little bit beyond our topic today, but that's a sort of a reality of 19th century Easton. So Oliver found a blacksmith shop essentially for making nails, and that's not a good way to make shovels, particularly the way he wanted to do it, which was through division of labor. Any blacksmith can make a shovel. It's not that difficult. But to make dozens and dozens of shovels, you needed to do something. So one of the first things he did, according to my sources, i.e. Greg, is that he modified the trip hammer so that it would be able to handle the more complex shape of a shovel. In fact, Oliver patented a trip hammer in 1810. So he was a technologist in his own right. He also made the tools, and he also very, very quickly built a handle shop, because this was not all a blacksmith job. With this division of labor, he brought in other people, two of which are important. One is Nathan Pratt, who was a blacksmith, and the other was John Bisbee. And Bisbee was either hired and came to Easton or was picked up along the road to Plymouth. But Bisbee was a handle man. And in the early days, shovel handles in Easton had the famous Ames bend. And the Ames bend was created by sticking the shovel handle in shovel shop pond and waiting for it to soften up before it was bent. Not so high tech, but it was effective. Well, once shovel production got underway, Oliver took the shovels himself to Boston. He would do a couple of dozen at a time, go to Boston and try to sell them. But Ames shovels were lighter than the traditional shovels that had come in from England and did not find ready acceptance from the merchants there. So oftentimes he would be coming home with a load of shovels, and he'd stop along the way, according to his great-grandson Winthrop, and offer them to farmers, saying, if you like them, just remember the OA brand, okay, or Oakes Ames brand. I love this picture of the ox carts, because this is what Oliver used to haul his stuff to Boston, and this ox transportation was used at the shovel works into the 20th century because the company never put in a yard engine to move shovels from here to there. So one of the problems was that the Queeset Brook, where the shovel shop was located, had a limited flow. Flow means it was a dinky little stream, but the good point is that it had a fair drop as it passed through Northeastern Village. So it was usable for power, but you had to be careful, and you might have to shut down during the summertime. So one of the very first things that Oliver tried to do is get control of as much of the water power as possible. Okay? And this particular slide, you can see I cited the source, which is Greg's Forging Ahead, indicates a number of things. One is the site of the shovel works, that's at J, and G, the site of the Easton Manufacturing Company, we'll get back to in a few minutes. But the initial target of Oliver was the Randall's grist mill. The Randall family had owned this property in this area for a number of years. The founder of the family was getting older, and the land was being sold off piecemeal. And so almost immediately, in 1805 and 1806, Oliver bought this land. And he also bought a little further up at D, the hoe shop. And the hoe shop was where Nathan Pratt had his blacksmith shop. And once that was purchased, Oliver installed a third person, Asa Waters, to manufacture hoes there. Asa Waters is an unsung hero of the family because while Oliver had gone to Plymouth, which I'll tell you about in a sec, Asa managed the shovel company here. How did that happen? Well, in 1805, Captain John Ames, Oliver's father, died and left the shovel works in West Bridgewater to Oliver. That was wonderful. That expanded his capacity, but at a time when he really didn't need to make more shovels, he needed to sell more shovels. So it was a mixed blessing, a blessing for the future. The bad point initially was that the dad had built up a huge pile of debt. So there were a couple of ways to proceed. Oliver could have hunkered down and made a lot of shovels and paid off the debt. That was not his character. So what he did was he mortgaged everything he had in town to his brother David, who I learned last night was complaining about how Oliver had settled their father's estate. But he was willing to loan $1,600, which Oliver used to purchase more land from Thomas Randall. So Oliver was loaded with debt. He was still looking to expand. What's going to happen? Well, the answer to what's going to happen was that luck came along and offered a positive solution. Captain Nathaniel Russell, who is the owner of the Plymouth Iron Works, offered him a job where he could make shovels and Russell would actually sell those shovels. And Oliver could also manage the shovel works. So what he did in 1807 was move his entire family and Nathan Pratt and John Bisbee to Plymouth, to where that little red dot is, which is this little house right here on Town Brook in Plymouth. The house is still there. It looks a heck of a lot better than when it was put up on Macris back in 1986. What did this mean to Oakes? Well, Oakes was 3 years old. His brother Horatio was 2. A little kid that age could see this as a great adventure. We know one thing. This is probably where Oakes developed his lifelong interest in fishing as a hobby, which did not bode well for his relationship with his dad and schoolmasters. But how could a boy resist when the town brook was right in back? And if you took a look at that map of Plymouth, which I so quickly passed by, Plymouth was a lot bigger than Easton. It had docks, it had rope works, it had all sorts of fascinating things for a young growing boy. More people than he had ever seen before back here in sleepy old Easton. Well, this is a map from 1832. The street grid hadn't really changed that much, and the number of houses were about the same. It was a very stimulating environment. Probably a stimulating environment for playing hooky. Oliver Ames was unlikely to allow his son to fish and wander the streets of Plymouth. Oliver Jr. in a reminiscence said that when I wasn't in school, I was expected to be working on the farm or working at the shovel works. And young people could actually get involved in the shovel making process at a stage called wedging, where little fingers were needed to wedge small pieces of wood or dirt between the blades and the handle as part of the process. So it's probably where he started, and he probably started at the bench beside John Bisbee. This is a picture of John Bisbee in his 80th year, shortly before he passed away. Bisbee and Pratt stayed with the shovel company for 60 plus years. And Bisbee did well for himself and has a nice little house that you can see today. And Nathan Pratt, for some reason, never got a house, but he boarded at the Millie Packard house, which is also something you can see, because it's still there today. Back in Easton, while all this stuff was going on in Plymouth, Oliver was buying more land. He was upgrading the shovel company. He was putting in that patented trip hammer that I had mentioned before. And ultimately, around 1813, he was able to finally get control of the Randall grist mill and all that property, which gave him a nice plot of land on what was the back end of the main street in town, which allowed him to move out of that little house next on Pond Street to a much larger home. He was clearly planning to come back to Easton, clearly planning to do that all through his time there, and ultimately was forced to do it because the Plymouth Iron Works closed. So he got back. He ended up in the house here, which is in the middle ground here, when it was half completed. He lived in the unplastered side while the even less finally constructed area was finished. So now the family was back. They were living in their own house, not a house that belonged to the iron foundry. And old Oliver, in the words of William Chaffin, decided he wanted to be lord of the village. Okay, and moved forward in that direction. A quick word here about William Chaffin. He was the town historian and wrote the first really extensive history of the town, in which, as we'll see, he was willing to praise just about any member of the Ames family who were their, he was their minister, and he certainly was patronized by the family, and so everything aimed at making the Ameses look particularly fantastic. However, he was asked by Oakes Ames of Borderland at the turn of the 20th century to write reminiscences of Oakes, who he knew extremely well, and Oliver, old Oliver, who he could know by talking to people who knew him. It's totally different kind of history. One is very, let's canonize these people, and the other one, well, they had their faults. The faults that Oakes had were charming faults that we can all sort of go along with. Oliver was a little different. So let's get into that a little bit. One of the first things that Oliver did when he was on the move back and forth between Plymouth and here was he built a textile mill. He didn't know much about textiles. According to Greg, he had built some textile machinery while in Plymouth for the iron foundry and decided to do the same thing here and then hire an agent to work on this. Now, if you follow Greg's thesis, this was sort of a ploy because what he really wanted to do was form a company, the Easton Manufacturing Company, which would end up with his partners controlling all the mills and the water flow along the river. This also was an opportunity to create Easton's first corporation. And corporations in those days, as we were discussing last night, were aimed at being part of the public good. All right. Ultimately, what happened was that Oliver retained a 3/8 share in the new corporation. The agent they hired to run this was so bad that he ended up losing $8,000 or $9,000 before he sold out. In 1830, the mill, deeply in debt, passed to a man named Shepherd Leach, who was Ames's main rival at the time for the dominant person in the village. Shepherd Leach had all the advantages over Oliver Ames. He was a resident of the town. He was well respected. He was a very benign man. Everybody liked him. He wasn't terribly pushy, and he wasn't terribly innovative. He was an iron man, but it was a man that had furnaces and forges and things like that. He wasn't trying to create an entirely new industry. Luckily for the history of the Ames family in Easton, he died in what we would call a car crash. His chaise tipped over and he was killed in 1832. So between 1813 and the 1820s, the machinations to get this Easton Manufacturing Company going really dominated the conversations at home as Oakes and Oliver Jr. were growing up. That deal-making aspect that we see later probably had its start in this little building right here. Why? Well, Oliver pushed his sons to get involved in businesses of their own. And Oakes really took advantage of this when he came of age. And one of the very first things he invested in was this particular building. He bought it from the estate of Shepherd Leach, sold the machinery, rented out the blacksmith shop, and then set up a bonnet wire maker in here to pay him rent. And ultimately what happened is after a number of years doing it that way, he took this prime piece of property that just happened to be in the way of this reclamation project of the shovel works. This is where the machine shop for the shovel works, which is, that's the big building right next to the street. Oakes sold that back to the company and made a profit. As Greg points out, just to be historically accurate, we don't know, because of the way the books were kept, whether this was sort of a holding company kind of arrangement or whether Oakes actually seriously was working independently. He also built a boarding house, the first boarding house in town. Not people in the 1820s, as the shovel company began to grow, began renting out spaces in their houses and maybe even building a small cape here and there for boarders. But Oakes was the first person to build a large boarding house, something he probably regretted. So what was the character of Oliver Ames? I have some quotes. You need to hear these. So in the history of Easton, Reverend Chaffin said, "He was a man of strong and resolute will, of great force of character, indomitable energy, and persevering industry. Born of the people, he was always very simple in his taste, as well as democratic in his feelings and principles. His judgment of persons were based upon what he believed to be the real worth of anyone without reference to station or condition." Sounds like a great guy. Writing privately, Reverend Chaffin described him this way: "He was a stern, puritanical type who hated shams and any unfaithfulness to duty, and his indignation against those who practiced them were terrible, sometimes being punctuated by the application of his boot to the offender." Okay. After reading this summer about Oliver, offenders seem to have included people who disagreed with his views on temperance, Unitarianism, the Whig Party, and pretty much anyone who disagreed for anything in general. People, it was noted, would cross the street rather than walk by him and face a potential cutting comment. And Chaffin concludes, in his likes and dislikes, he was equally decided. So summing up, his temperament was volcanic. And I think this daguerreotype, which is the rare one that you don't normally see, the sepia-toned one, kind of sums up his character much better than the engraving from an earlier one. So even when the boys got older, in 1844, Oliver retires and gives up day-to-day management of the company. Even then, the boys were still terrified of their father's temperament. And there are all sorts of wonderful stories about Oliver looking at the modern version of his shovel, not liking it, and smashing them to pieces, and then yelling at the boys. My favorite one is that they brought in new handle bending machines, and Oliver didn't like those, so he went to the company teamster and got him to load them on the company carts and hide them in a barn so that Oakes and Oliver couldn't find them. Like many guys in his generation, Oliver was a very strict disciplinarian and used the horsewhip a lot. So this was probably excessive because not only did he, not spare the rod when it came to like inattentiveness to school practices, and Oakes was definitely inattentive to school practices. It involved wrestling. It was said that Oliver would take Horatio and Oakes out into the barn to teach them wrestling moves. Oliver was a champion wrestler. And he would bring the horsewhip with him to keep them up to the mark. Okay. Well, Horatio was by far the better wrestler. He became a champion. Oakes, the oldest brother, did not become the champion. Okay. So now here's the problem for him. He's not going to be a champion wrestler, and his younger brother, Oliver Jr., was the scholarly one. So he was doing better in school. As Reverend Chaffin said, Oakes' inattentiveness to his studies gave his father a lot of opportunity to exercise his strong right arm with that horsewhip. And when that didn't work, Oliver hired a schoolmaster whose main claim to fame was that he had actually scarred a child with a horsewhip. This feeling extended to the next generation. Poor Frank Ames, which was the youngest son of Oakes, was so terrified of his grandfather that one day when he was in his teens and was paddling around in a canoe with his cousin, one of the Gilmores, when he was supposed to be working at the shovel works, his grandfather showed up and started to yell at him to come ashore. He was so terrified he rolled to the other side of the pond and took off. That's going to be interesting. And at the same time, the Gilmore boy, who lived 9 miles away, ran all the way home. The good news for our friend was that Oakes was very good with shovels. And obviously that was something his father was really proud of. So around the age of 16, Oakes began a more formal apprenticeship at the shovel works. It became tradition in the Ames family that any male member of the family, whether they were going to be working in the front office or not, learned to make a shovel. And Oakes's son, Oliver III, who became governor of Massachusetts, got to be so good at that the shovels that went to the centennial celebration in 1876 were made completely by him. Oakes was very good at it. Between age 16 and age 21, he went through the whole series and became the superintendent of the manufacturing process before moving into the main office, where he wasn't. That was not his forte. His forte was the actual process of making shovels. That's the site of the boarding house there, and this is the map of the town. At age 25, you can see that it wasn't as well developed as you might imagine for 1825. There were still relatively few houses there. Ramcat is an interesting name. We don't quite know where that came from, but that's where the boarding house was located. In 1827, Oakes married Eveline Gilmore Ames from Southeastern. She was the she was the daughter of a very, very prosperous farmer who had gone through the common schools of the town and learned all the womanly arts of the time, cooking, cleaning, sewing, etc., in her mother's kitchen. And they got together. She was, I think this is a picture from late in her life, a lovely woman and certainly very attractive. They were married and very quickly began to produce children. She very quickly began to take over the duties of a modern woman. Now, we're blessed by having 2 years of her diaries, for 1851, 1852, which were the 24th and 25th years of her marriage. So we're not talking about a young bride. And it's very surprising how much drudgery this woman went through. She was constantly sewing. She was constantly washing and supervising the one or two part-time help that she had there. But she also knew that as the wife of the most prominent family in town, she had other duties. So those other duties included a lot of visiting. Visiting was what replaced television in those days. So the John Torrey House, which is, for Eastern residents, the site of Walter's Barbershop now, that housed her sister-in-law and brother-in-law, or sister and brother-in-law, and the family visited there often. The Benjamin Buck House was across the street. Buck was a poor man who Eveline and Oakes visited. In fact, she visited a lot, and so did Oakes. Oakes was a real member of the community, someone who knew the needs of the people and took care of the needs of the people. He also was the person who dealt with the Irish. And the Irish issue became a big deal in this country beginning in the 1840s. And we were talking last night of how this propped up. And one of the ways that it did was the Thira Wars in New York City, where Irish and Native American lower class people supported American actors, and the upper class supported British actors, which led to a huge riot that took place in May of 1848 and 1849. We're pretty sure that Oakes was aware of this. It was in, as they say, in all the papers. And it was an indication of rising discontent in the country. 20 years later, Oakes came down on the side of the aristocrats when he supported the actor Edwin Booth, who was trying to bring good taste to New Yorkers by building the Booth Theater. Congressman at that time, Ames, took out a mortgage on the building, and when it almost inevitably went bankrupt, the Ames family ran the theater for several years. And this particular piece of artwork that was in the theater is now in Oakes Ames Memorial Hall, so you'll be able to see this today when you go to the reception. But it's a mark that times were changing. Reform movements swept through the country, and a number of Easterners became involved. The Temperance Movement was the first. Old Oliver in 1825 stopped giving a daily rum ration to his workers and replaced it with switchel. The local minister, the congregational minister, did the same. And the man in the middle, the mystery man that we don't have a picture of, Caleb Swan, for medical reasons supported the Temperance Movement. Oliver was a thoroughgoing Unitarian and basically said between Mohammedanism and Congregationalism, he would rather support the latter rather than the former. So there was a almost immediate falling out between Luther and Oliver Ames. Swan and Oliver maintained a friendship throughout most of their lives. Poor Henry French showed up one day courting Oakes's youngest daughter, and refused the coffee, refused the tea, and then Evelina said, well, we have some cider. I was making mince pie. Would you like some cider? And before he could answer yes or no, Oakes thundered, no one shall be drinking in my house. And that was the end of it, until, and this very telling about their marriage, Oakes went to work, and Evelina said, "So, would you like to have some cider?" And Mr. French said, "Oh no, I would never do anything behind Mr. Ames's back that I wouldn't do in his front." And so he ended up marrying the daughter of the family and honeymooning in the honeymoon cottage, which is right next door now to Oakes Ames Hall. Okay, the Irish. Oakes and Oliver quickly took over in 1844, and at that time there were relatively few Irishmen in the shovel works. A decade later, 70% of the workforce was Irish. That was totally different than the rest of the community, which was Yankee and extremely upset with the fact that the Irish were there. Even old Oliver was extremely upset. And the boys told him, well, if we can't get the best, second best will have to do. And they overruled him. One of the rare occasions when they did overrule him. And they began, the boys, particularly Oakes, began to support their workers. People that had the skill of making shovels were valuable. So Oakes did go out of his way to keep his workers. For instance, one example related to temperance. Oakes' favorite holiday was the 4th of July. There are 3 or 4 anecdotes about how he would give people money to go to Boston to watch the 4th of July. He was approached one day by an Irish worker who was a known drinker, saying, "I'd like to take time off to go to the 4th of July celebration in Boston." Oakes said, "You know, you're going to get drunk and you're not going to show up for work." And, "Oh, no, Mr. Ames, no, it'll be fine." So Oakes finally relented. The man went off and didn't show up on Monday, didn't show up on Tuesday. His sister came to the shovel works and, "Mr. Ames, where's my brother?" This is an example of Mr. Ames's humor. "He's dead, dear." And of course, that had a very bad reaction. It was an example of that's Oakes, that's his humor. Ultimately, though, you would think that such a strong temperance man might fire the guy for not showing up for a couple of days. He did return, and he went right back into the workforce. Oakes was not about to give up on an Irish worker and risk leading to a strike. There was no strike at the shovel works for the interior people during the time of Oakes' management. The farm workers struck in 1853 to have the same number of hours in a day as the. So this is a list of the infractions of the Irishmen and some Yankees in the boarding houses. And in order to cut back on that, in 1851, after holding church services in that boarding house, Oakes and Oliver used company money to donate this space where the first Catholic chapel was. I've oftentimes got in trouble for saying this, but the company also donated land right next door for the town lockup. And the tradition in the town is they put the lockup right next to the church so that the guys who were there with a terrible hangover on Sunday morning could hear the musical singing at the church. The Irish religion wasn't going over very well. At one point, Evelina visited Palm Sunday services and said, "I waited an hour for the priest to show up. He showed up. He dribbled over a bunch of stuff in Latin, and after 3 hours, I left and went to my own church in the afternoon." That was advanced thinking for most people in Easton at the time. And here are a couple of pictures. One of the good things is that despite the fact that only a few Irishmen remained in Easton for a long time, turnover was heavy for both males and for both natives and Irish, but heavier for Irish. The ones that were here were able to save enough money to build their own houses. This is William Hayes' house. He was the leading spokesman for the Irish. Stop me if you've heard this one. The leader of the Irish went to old Oliver, God knows why they went to him, and said, "Mr. Ames, could you please give up Bible reading in the public schools?" It was a Protestant Bible, and they were Catholic. And Oliver said, "William Hayes, you used to come to me with hat in hand, and now you're coming asking to change our institutions. Well, if you don't like our institutions, damn you, go back to where you came from. Sounds a little bit like today. And that's a good spot to maybe stop here, because what's happening at this point, we're into the 1840s, we're into the 1850s. There's this huge beginning of party realignments. And one of the enigmas of the Ames family is, how did they form the Republican Party? We know that by the time he died, old Oliver was a staunch Republican, but at the height of the anti-immigrant sentiments, he was a know-nothing. He invited Ned Buntline, the man that sponsored the riot that we were just talking about, to come in and speak in the town church in northeastern village. His old friend Caleb Swan drove him crazy by reporting everything that happened at the secret know-nothing meetings. The term know-nothing comes from what members of the party were supposed to say when they were asked what was going on. But with 3/4 of the shovel factory Irish workers, how did Oakes and how did Oliver handle this transition from being members of the Whig Party to being members of the Republican Party? Did they have that know-nothing phase? It looks as if they didn't. But if you were a betting man and looking in the 1840s and 1850s, you would discover that it looked as if Oliver Jr. would be the guy that ended up in Congress, and not Oakes. And that's another one of the another guy. Yes?
We're going to have to stop.
That's fine. I'm stopping right now.
No, it was great. And I'm sorry, but we won't have time for questions. Or was that your purpose the whole time, right?
What a shame.
Yeah. But anyway,
I'll be
Ed.
available later today if anybody wants to talk to me, or if anybody's still speaking to me.
Oh, they will be. They will be, Ed. We always come back. Thank you. So we'll just take a very short break, say maybe a few minutes. And